It is the summer of 1914. In a smoke-filled office in Whitehall, London, the First Lord of the Admiralty sits staring at a ledger. The British Empire controls a quarter of the globe. The sun never sets on its territory. But this man is terrified. He's not afraid of the Kaiser's army or the Russian hordes. He's afraid of running out of fuel. History will tell you Britain invaded Iraq to defeat the Ottoman Turks. That is a lie. Britain invaded Iraq because Winston Churchill had just bet the entire Royal Navy on a liquid that Britain did not have. They didn't invade for glory. They invaded for the balance sheet. For a century, the British Empire had been powered by coal, Welsh coal, abundant, cheap, and most importantly, British coal. Every battleship in the Royal Navy burned this black rock. Every coaling station from Gibraltar to Singapore was stacked with mountains of Welsh anthracite. As long as the world ran on coal, Britain controlled the fuel. Britain controlled the seas. Britain controlled everything. These were the fastest and most powerful warships ever built. Churchill ran exclusively on oil that would reshape the entire Middle East. But strategically it was a catastrophe. He ordered the Royal Navy to switch from coal not in Wales, to oil, not in Scotland. From an engineering perspective, by switching to oil, Churchill had made the Royal Navy dependent on a foreign substance warships imported from thousands of miles away. It burned cleaner, so he had traded absolute security for tactical superiority, and it was liquid. This single decision created a panic in the British government that would lead directly to the invasion of Mesopotamia. The range was unlimited. It turned the malarial swamps of Ottoman Iraq into the most valuable territory on Earth. Elizabeth class. This is the story. These were the fastest and most powerful warships ever built. An empire. They ran exclusively on oil that did not yet exist. But strategically, it was a catastrophe. It is the story of a corporate Britain had no oil, disguised as not in Wales, not in Scotland, a decade earlier, not in England. A man named William By switching to oil, Churchill had made the Royal Navy dependent on a foreign substance. He was imported from thousands of miles away, looking for the next big score. He had traded absolute security for tactical superiority. French geologists told him about oil secrets. This single decision created a panic in the British government that would lead directly to the invasion of Mesopotamia. The world's oil came from Pennsylvania and Baku in Russia. Drilling in Persia seemed insane, but Darcy was a gambler. He used his connections to approach the Shah of Persia. In 1901, he signed a historic concession giving him exclusive rights to search for oil across a territory larger than France. The deal would last 60 years. In exchange, the Shah got £20,000 in cash and a promise of 16% of future profits. For 7 years, Darcy bled money into the sand. He hired a self-taught engineer named George Reynolds the Middle East to lead the drilling expedition. The world's oil came from Pennsylvania by mule and camel through the Zagros Mountains. Drilling in Persia seemed insane. His men faced typhoid, Darcy was a gambler, smallpox, and cholera. He used his connections to approach local tribesmen, harassed them, and demanded bribes. In 1901, he signed a historic concession giving him exclusive rights to search for oil across a territory larger than France. Supplies were stolen. The deal would last 60 years. Back in London, in exchange, spent his the Shah got £20,000 in cash. He mortgaged his and a promise of 16% of future profits. He was on the brink of total bankruptcy. For 7 years, Darcy bled money. The British Admiralty watched with interest. He hired a self-taught engineer named George Reynolds to lead the drilling expedition. The directors in London finally lost their nerve. Reynolds dragged heavy equipment. They sent Reynolds a telegram ordering him to stop drilling. Mountains, pack up, and come home. His men faced typhoid, the money was gone, and cholera. The dream was over. Local tribesmen harassed was stubborn and demanded bribes. He had spent years in the desert. The heat reached 120 degrees in the shade. When he received the telegram, drills broke against hard rock. It was an act of insubordination that saved the British Empire. Darcy spent his entire Australian fortune. On the morning of May 26, 1908, he mortgaged his house. A low rumble was heard underground at a drilling site. He was on the brink of total bankruptcy. The British rumble turned into a roar, but refused to Suddenly, help. A fountain of black crude oil shot 50 feet in London into the air. Finally lost their nerve. They had struck one of the largest oil fields in history, ordering him to stop drilling. Darcy immediately formed the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The money was gone. This company would eventually become BP, British Petroleum. But Reynolds was stubborn. They began construction on a massive infrastructure project. He believed he was close. They built a pipeline from the mountains down to the Persian Gulf. They built a refinery on a swampy island called Abadan in the Shatt al-Arab waterway. On the morning of May 26, suddenly the Persian Gulf was no longer a sleepy backwater of pearl divers. At a drilling site it was the future gas station of the British Empire. The rumble turned into a roar. But there was a geopolitical problem. A fountain of black oil was in Persia, shot 50 feet. The only way to export it was through the Shatt al-Arab river. They had struck one of the largest oil fields in history. This river was the border between Persia immediately formed the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The refinery at Abadan would eventually become BP, British
to the
Petroleum.
west, just across the water,
They began construction
on a massive
infrastructure
project.
They built
The
a
Ottoman
pipeline
Turks
from the
watched
mountains
these
down to the
developments with
Persian
deep
Gulf.
suspicion.
They built a refinery on
British
a swampy
gunboats
island
patrolling
called
the river.
Abadan in the
They saw
Shatt
British
al-Arab
geologists
waterway.
looking across the water
Suddenly, the
with
Persian
hungry
Gulf
eyes.
was no longer a sleepy
The Ottomans knew
backwater
that
of
geology
pearl
does
divers.
not respect
It was
political
the future
borders.
gas station
If
of
there
the
was
British
oil
Empire,
on the Persian side,
but there was a
it probably
geopolitical
continued
problem.
underground into
The oil
Ottoman
was in
lands,
Persia,
into
but the only
Basra,
way to export it
into
was through the
Baghdad,
Shatt al-Arab
into
river.
Mosul.
In
This
London,
river was
Winston
the border
Churchill
between
realized
Persia
he could not rely
and the
on a
Ottoman
private
Empire.
company to fuel the Royal
The
Navy.
refinery at Abadan sat
Private
right on
companies
this
were
border.
unreliable.
To the west,
They could go
just across the
bankrupt.
water,
They
lay
could
the
sell to
Ottoman
the highest
province
bidder.
of Basra.
They could be bought by foreign
The Ottoman
rivals like
Turks
Standard
watched these
Oil or
developments
Royal
with
Dutch
deep
Shell.
suspicion.
So Churchill
They
did
saw
something
British
unprecedented
gunboats
in
patrolling the
British
river.
history.
They saw
In the
British
summer of
geologists
1914,
looking across
just
the
weeks
water with
before
hungry
World
eyes.
War I began,
The
he
Ottomans
marched into
knew
the
that
House of
geology
Commons.
does not respect
He
political
convinced Parliament
borders.
to pass a bill
If there was
authorizing
oil on the
government
Persian
to buy a
side,
controlling
it
interest
probably
in the
continued
Anglo-Persian Oil
underground
Company.
into Ottoman lands.
The British government bought
into Basra,
51% of the
into
shares.
Baghdad, into
This
Mosul.
is the crucial detail.
In London,
often
Winston
missing
Churchill
from history
realized
books.
he could not rely on a private
When
company
World War
to fuel
I
the Royal
started,
Navy.
the Anglo-Persian
Private companies
Oil
were
Company
unreliable.
was not just a
They could
British
go
company.
bankrupt.
It was
They
the
could sell
British
to the
government.
highest bidder. They
Its
could be bought
profits
by
were the
foreign
Treasury's
rivals like
profits.
Standard Oil or
Its
Royal
security
Dutch
was
Shell.
the state's security.
So Churchill did something
The
unprecedented
corporation
in
and the
British
empire
history.
had merged
In the
into
summer
one.
of 1914, just
When
weeks
Archduke
before
Franz
World War I
Ferdinand
began,
was assassinated
he
in
marched
Sarajevo,
into the House of Commons.
the dominoes of
He
alliance
convinced
began
Parliament
to
to
fall
pass a bill
across Europe.
authorizing the government
British
to buy
war
a
planners
controlling
looked at the
interest
map.
in the
They
Anglo-Persian
saw the
Oil
threat of
Company.
Germany. They saw the threat to France. But their eyes kept drifting to the Shatt al-Arab. The Ottoman Empire had not yet entered the war. They were watching and waiting. But the British knew the Ottomans were drifting toward Germany. The Germans were building a railway from Berlin to Baghdad. If the Ottomans joined Germany, they could easily cut the British pipeline. They could shell the Abadan refinery from the Basra side of the river. They could choke off the fuel supply of the Royal Navy just as war began. On October 2nd, 1914, weeks before any war was declared with Turkey, the British government sent a secret order to the government of India. But their eyes kept drifting to the Shatt al-Arab. They ordered a brigade of the Indian Army. The Ottoman Empire had not yet entered the Gulf. They were watching. Their destination was the island of Bahrain. But the British knew the Ottomans were drifting toward Germany. At the Ottoman Germans were building a railway from Berlin to Baghdad. This was not a defensive move. If the Ottomans joined Germany, this was a preemptive. They could easily cut the British pipeline. They could shell the Abadan refinery from the Basra side of the river. Britain formally they could choke off the fuel supply of the Royal Navy just as war began. British warships in the Gulf opened fire on the Ottoman fort at weeks before any war was declared. The invasion of Iraq had begun. The British soldiers who landed in the mud were mostly Indian troops led by British officers. They ordered a brigade of the Indian Army to sail immediately to the Persian Gulf. They were part of Indian Expeditionary Force D. Their destination
They expected
was the
a minor
island of
colonial
Bahrain.
skirmish.
Their mission was to be
They
ready
expected
to
to
strike
fight a
at the
few
Ottoman
ragtag
oil
Ottoman
lands the
soldiers,
moment war
secure
began.
the pipeline.
This was
and
not a
sit
defensive
tight.
move.
At
This
first,
was a preemptive
that is exactly
corporate
what
security
happened.
operation.
The Ottoman forces in Basra were
On
weak,
November 5th,
poorly equipped,
1914,
and demoralized.
Britain formally
They melted
declared
away
war
before
on
the British
Ottoman
advance.
Empire. The very
The British
next day,
captured Basra
British warships
on November
in the Gulf
22nd,
opened fire on the
1914.
Ottoman fort at
General
Fao.
Barrett entered the city in
invasion
a
of
grand
Iraq had
procession.
begun.
He read a
The British
proclamation
soldiers
to the
who landed
local
in the
Arab
mud were
population.
mostly Indian
He told them
troops
the
led by
British had
British
come as
officers.
liberators, not
They were
conquerors.
part of Indian
He promised
Expeditionary
freedom from
Force
centuries
D.
of Turkish tyranny.
They expected a
It
minor
was a
colonial
speech that would be
skirmish.
repeated almost word for
They expected
word
to
in
fight
other
a few
invasions
ragtag
century
Ottoman
later.
soldiers with Basra
secure the
secured.
pipeline
The oil
and sit
refinery
tight.
at Abadan was
At
safe.
first, that is
The
exactly
pipeline
what
was
happened.
secure.
The
fuel for
Ottoman
the Navy
forces
was
in
flowing.
Basra were weak,
The mission was
poorly
accomplished.
equipped, and
The
demoralized.
prudent military strategy
They melted
would have been
away
to stop
before the
right
British
there.
advance.
But empires
The
are
British
rarely
captured
prudent.
Basra
And
on
oil
November
has a way of
22nd,
making men
1914.
In
General
London and
Barrett
Delhi,
entered the city
planners
in a
began
grand
to look at the
procession.
map again.
He read a
They saw
proclamation
that they
to the
had
local
secured the
Arab
refinery.
population.
But
He
the
told them
oil
the
fields
British had come as
themselves were still
liberators,
vulnerable.
not conquerors.
And more importantly,
he promised
there were
freedom
rumors
from
of even
centuries of
bigger
Turkish
oil
tyranny.
fields further north.
It was a speech
German
that would
and
be
British
repeated almost
geologists had
word
been
for word
whispering
in
for
other
years
invasions
about
a
the
century
immense
later.
oil potential
With
of
Basra
Mosul
secured,
there was a shadowy company
at
called the
was
Turkish
safe.
Petroleum
The pipeline
Company
was
exploring
secure.
these regions. The fuel for the Navy
It
was
involved
flowing.
British interests,
The mission
German
was accomplished.
interests,
And a
the
mysterious
prudent military
Armenian
strategy would have
businessman
been to
named
stop right
Kalusta
there.
Gulbenkian. But empires are rarely
He was
prudent.
known as Mr. 5%.
And oil has a way of making
because
men
he always
greedy.
kept 5% of every
In London
deal.
and Delhi,
The British
planners
government
began to look
realized
at the
that if
map
they
again.
stayed in Basra,
They saw that they had
only
secured
controlled
the
the exit
refinery.
point.
But the oil
But
fields
if they
marched
themselves were
north
still vulnerable
and took Baghdad
and, more
and
importantly,
Mosul.
There were
They would
rumors
control
of
the
even
source.
bigger oil fields further
They would control
north.
the greatest
German and
potential
British
oil
geologists
reserve on
had
the
been
planet.
whispering for years about the
This is
immense
where mission
oil
creep
potential
began.
of Mosul.
The
There was a
logic
shadowy
shifted from
company called
defense
the Turkish
to conquest.
Petroleum Company exploring
The
these
man
regions.
chosen to lead this push
It involved
was
British
General
interests,
Charles
German
Townshend.
interests, and a mysterious
Townshend
Armenian
was
businessman
ambitious and
named
arrogant.
Kalusta
He
Gulbenkian.
desperately wanted military glory
He was
to
known as
rival the
Mr.
great
5%
generals of history.
because he always kept
He did not
5%
care
of
about
every
oil.
deal.
He cared
The
about
British government
medals,
realized that if
promotion,
they
and
stayed in
fame,
Basra,
but his
they
personal
only controlled
ambition
the exit
aligned perfectly with the
But
government's
if they marched
greed.
north,
Townshend
and
led
took
his army up
Baghdad
the
and
Tigris
Mosul,
River. They would
the
control
geography of
source.
Iraq is defined by
They
two
would
great
control
rivers,
the greatest
the Tigris
potential
and the
oil
Euphrates.
reserve on the planet.
Between them lies a flat,
This is where
featureless
mission
plain.
creep began.
In summer, the
The
heat
logic
reaches
shifted from
120
defense
degrees
to conquest.
The dust is choking.
The man
The flies
chosen to
drive
lead
men
this push
mad.
was General
As Townshend
Charles
marched
Townshend.
north, the terrain changed.
Townshend was
The swamps
ambitious
of Basra
and arrogant.
gave way to
He
dry,
desperately
hard
wanted
desert.
military
British
glory to
supply
rival the
lines
great
stretched
generals
thinner
of history.
and thinner. They
He did not
relied on
care
old
about
paddle
oil.
steamers
He
to
cared
bring
about
food,
medals,
ammunition,
promotion,
and
and
medical
fame.
supplies up
But
the
his
winding
personal
river.
ambition aligned
The Ottomans
perfectly
were
with the
retreating,
government's greed.
but they were not
Townshend
defeated.
led his army up the
They were
Tigris
trading
River.
space for time. The geography of
They were
Iraq
drawing
is
the
defined
British
by two
deeper
great
into a
rivers,
trap.
the Tigris and the
Townshend
Euphrates.
captured the town of
Between
Amara
them lies
in
a flat,
daring raid.
featureless plain.
Then he
In
captured
summer,
Kut
the
al-Amara.
heat reaches 120
He was winning
degrees.
victories that looked
The
great
dust
in
is
London
choking.
newspapers.
The flies drive
Politicians
men
were
mad.
delighted.
As
They
Townshend
saw a cheap
marched
victory
north,
in the Middle
the
East
terrain
to
changed.
offset the horror
The
of the
swamps of
trenches in
Basra
France.
gave way to dry,
They
hard
urged him
desert.
to keep going.
British supply
But the men
lines
on the ground
stretched
were
thinner
suffering.
and thinner.
The medical
They relied
situation
on
was
old paddle
appalling.
steamers to
There were
bring
not enough
food,
doctors.
ammunition,
There were not
and
enough
medical
boats to
supplies up
evacuate the
winding
wounded.
river.
Men were dying
The
of heat
Ottomans were
stroke,
retreating,
malaria, and
but
dysentery.
they were not defeated.
The machinery of
They
war
were
was
trading
breaking
space
down
for
in the
time.
abrasive sand.
They were drawing the
But
British
the lure of
deeper into a
Baghdad was
trap.
too strong.
Townshend
Baghdad
captured
was
the
the
town
prize.
of Amara.
It was the
in a
historic
daring
capital
raid.
of the Caliphate.
Then he captured
Capturing
Kut
it would be a
al-Amara.
symbolic triumph.
He was
echoing
winning
across the
victories that
Muslim
looked
world.
great in London
And
newspapers.
beyond Baghdad lay Mosul
Politicians
and
were
the Black
delighted.
Gold. They saw
In
a
late
cheap victory in the
1915,
Middle East
Townshend
to
was
offset
ordered
the
to make
horror
a
of the
final
trenches
dash
in
for
France.
Baghdad.
They urged
He
him to
marched
keep
his
going,
exhausted army
but
to
the
a
men
place
on the
called
ground were
Ctesiphon,
suffering.
just
The
20
medical
miles from the
situation
city.
was appalling.
There
were
among
not enough
ancient
doctors.
Persian
There were
ruins,
not enough
he
boats
met
to
the main
evacuate the
Ottoman
wounded.
army.
Men were dying
The
of
Battle
heat
of
stroke,
Ctesiphon
malaria, and
was a
dysentery.
bloodbath.
The machinery of
Ottomans
war
had
was
dug in
breaking
deep.
down in the
They had
abrasive
fresh
sand.
reserves from the north.
But the lure
They
of
had
Baghdad was
superior
too strong.
artillery.
Baghdad was the
Townshend
prize.
threw his
It
men
was the
against
historic
Turkish
capital
trenches
of the
time and
Caliphate.
time again.
Capturing
The British
it would be a
and Indian
symbolic
troops
triumph
charged
echoing
into
across
machine
the
gun
Muslim
fire.
world.
They were slaughtered.
And beyond Baghdad lay
Townshend
Mosul and
lost
the
a
Black
third
Gold.
of his army in a single
In
day.
late 1915,
he looked at the shattered
Townshend
remnants
was
of
ordered
his
to make
force
a final
and
dash
realized
for
he could not
Baghdad.
take Baghdad. He marched his exhausted
He had to
army to a
retreat.
place called Ctesiphon.
He fell back
just
to the
20
town of
miles from
Kut
the city.
al-Amara, a miserable
There,
collection
among
of mud
ancient
houses
Persian
sitting in a
ruins,
loop of the
he met
Tigris
the
River.
main Ottoman army.
He decided to dig
The
in
Battle of
and wait for
Ctesiphon
reinforcements.
was a bloodbath.
He thought it would be a
The
short
Ottomans
siege.
had dug in
He
deep.
thought the British
They had fresh
Empire would come
reserves
to
from the
save him.
north.
He
They
was
had
wrong.
superior artillery.
The Ottoman army surrounded
Townshend
Kut.
threw his
They
men
dug
against
trenches
Turkish
around the
trenches
town,
time and time
sealing
again.
it completely.
The British and Indian
The
troops
siege of
charged
Kut had
into
begun.
machine gun fire.
Inside the
They were
town,
slaughtered.
13,000 British and Indian soldiers were trapped along with the
He
local
looked at the
civilian
shattered remnants
population.
of his force
They
and
had
realized
limited
he
food.
could not take Baghdad.
They had limited ammunition.
He had to retreat.
They were about to enter a winter
He
of
fell
hell.
back to the town of Kut al-Amara.
British command in
a
Basra
miserable
tried
collection of
desperately
mud
to break the
houses
siege.
sitting in a loop of the
They sent
Tigris
relief
River.
column after relief column
He
charging
decided
up the
to
river.
dig in and wait for
But the
reinforcements.
terrain was a nightmare.
He thought it would
The
be a
ground
short
was
siege
flat and offered
he
no
thought
cover.
the British Empire would
Ottoman
come to save
machine
him.
gunners mowed
He was
down
wrong.
the relief forces by
The Ottoman
thousands.
army surrounded Kut.
23,000
They dug
men
trenches
died
around the
trying
town
to rescue the
sealing it
13,000
completely.
inside Kut.
The siege of Kut had
Think
begun.
about that number.
Inside the town,
More men died trying to
13,000
save
British
the
and
trapped
Indian
force than were
soldiers were
actually
trapped along
trapped.
with the local civilian
Inside
population.
the town,
They had
starvation
limited
set
food.
in.
Rations
They had
were
limited
cut
ammunition
again
and again.
They were about
Soldiers
to
began
enter a
to eat
winter of
horses
hell.
and mules. Then
British
they ran
command
out
in
of
Basra
animals.
tried desperately
British
to break the
officers
siege.
tried to convince
convince
They
Indian
sent
troops
relief
to
column
eat
after
horse
relief
meat.
column charging up
Many
the river.
refused for religious
But the
reasons,
terrain was a nightmare.
preferring to starve
The
rather
ground
than
was
violate
flat
their faith.
and offered no cover.
Disease ran rampant.
Ottoman machine gunners
the stench of the
mowed
town
down the
became
relief forces
unbearable
by the
as sewage
thousands.
filled the trenches.
23,000 men died in
trying to
headquarters,
rescue the
sending
13,000
increasingly
inside
desperate
cut.
telegrams to Basra.
Think about that
In a
number.
final act of desperation,
More men died
he offered
trying
the
to
Ottoman
save the
commander
trapped
£1
force
million
that were actually
in gold
trapped.
if he would just let the
Inside
army go.
the town, starvation
The Ottoman
set in.
commander,
Rations
Khalil
were cut
Pasha,
again and
laughed
again.
at the offer.
Soldiers began
He
to
said
eat
the British
horses and
Empire
mules.
could not buy
Then
its
they
way
ran
out.
out of animals. British
On April
officers
29,
tried to convince Indian troops to eat
after
horsemeat.
147 days
for
for
religious reasons,
General
preferring
Townshend
to starve
surrendered.
rather than violate their faith.
It was the greatest
Disease
humiliation
ran
in the
rampant.
history of the British
The stench
Army.
of the town became
greater
unbearable
even than
as
Yorktown
sewage filled the trenches.
or the fall of Khartoum.
Townshend sat in his
13,000
headquarters,
men
sending
marched out
increasingly
into captivity.
desperate telegrams
They
to
were
Basra.
skeleton thin.
In a final
Their
act of
uniforms hung off their
desperation,
frames.
he offered the
They were
Ottoman
ragged
commander
and
£1 million
broken.
in gold.
The Ottoman
if he would
soldiers
just let
marched
the
them
army
north
go.
across the desert toward
The
prisoner
Ottoman
camps in
commander,
Anatolia.
Khalil Pasha,
Thousands
laughed at
died
the
on the
offer.
march.
He
They
said
died
the
of
British
thirst.
Empire could
They
not
died of
buy
beatings.
its way out.
They died of sheer exhaustion,
On April
leaving a
29th,
trail of bodies in the
1916,
sand.
after
Townshend himself was
147
treated like a
days
royal
of
guest.
siege,
He was
General
taken to an
Townshend
island near Istanbul
surrendered.
where he lived in a luxury
It was the
villa.
greatest humiliation
He drank
in the
tea with
history of
Turkish
the British
officers,
Army.
but his men
Greater
were rotting
even
in
than
desert
Yorktown
camps.
or the
The
fall of
disaster at
Khartoum.
Kut should have ended the British
13,000
adventure in
men
Iraq.
marched out into captivity.
It proved the invasion was
They
a
were
mistake.
skeleton thin.
It proved the
Their
cost in
uniforms
blood and
hung off
treasure
their
was
frames.
far too high.
They were ragged,
But
and
remember the
broken.
oil. The Ottoman
British
soldiers
government could
marched
not
them
walk
north
away.
across the desert
They had
toward
bought the
prisoner camps in
Anglo-Persian Oil
Anatolia.
Company.
Thousands
They needed
died
fuel
on the
for the
march.
fleet.
They died of thirst.
And now they needed
They
revenge
died of
to
beatings.
restore imperial
They died of sheer
prestige.
exhaustion, leaving
London
a trail of
decided
bodies
they could
in the
not
sand.
leave Iraq.
Townshend himself
Instead,
was
they
treated
would
like a
double
royal
down.
guest. He was
They
taken
sent
to
a
an
new
island
general,
near Istanbul
a cold
where he
and
lived in a
calculating
luxury
man
villa.
named Frederick
He drank
Maud.
tea with
They
Turkish
sent him with
officers,
overwhelming
but his
force.
men were rotting
They
in
sent
desert
new
camps.
heavy guns,
The
new
disaster
planes,
at
new
Kut
tanks,
should have
and
ended the
thousands of
British
fresh
adventure in
troops.
Iraq.
They built a railway
proved
from
the
Basra
invasion
to
was a
supply the
mistake.
front. They
It
turned
proved
the
the cost
invasion
in
from a
blood and
colonial
treasure was
adventure
far too high.
into a massive
But remember
industrial
the oil.
operation.
The British
General
government
Maud
could not
did
walk
not
away.
rush. He
They had bought
methodically
the
smashed the
Anglo-Persian
Ottoman
Oil
defenses.
Company.
He
They
recaptured
needed fuel
Kut
for the fleet.
He avenged the dead.
And now they needed
in March
revenge to restore
1917,
imperial
he marched into
prestige.
Baghdad. Once
London
again,
decided they could not
proclamation was
leave
read to
Iraq.
the citizens. Instead,
Our armies
they
do
would
not
double
come
as
down.
conquerors or enemies.
They sent a
but as
new general,
liberators.
a cold and
But the war
calculating
was
man
not
named
over.
Frederick
The
Maud.
British controlled
They sent
Baghdad
him with
and Basra,
overwhelming
but
force.
they still did not
They sent
control
new
Mosul.
heavy guns, new
The oil
planes,
fields of
new
the north,
tanks,
the real
and thousands
pride,
of
were
fresh
still in
troops.
Ottoman hands.
They built a railway from
And as the
Basra
war
to
in
supply
Europe
the
dragged
front.
toward its
They
end
turned
in
the invasion
1918,
from a colonial
the race for
adventure
Mosul became
into
the
a
most
massive
important
industrial
objective of the entire
operation.
Middle Eastern
General
campaign.
Maud did not rush.
It was a race against
He methodically
time.
smashed the
The
Ottoman
British
defenses.
knew the war was ending.
He recaptured Kut.
They knew a peace
He
treaty would
avenged
be
the
signed
dead.
soon.
And in March
And they knew that under
1917,
international
he marched
law,
into Baghdad.
they could only claim
Once
territory
again,
they
the
physically
proclamation was
occupied
read to the
when the
citizens.
final whistle blew.
Our armies do not
The date
come
was
as
October
conquerors or
30th,
enemies,
1918,
but as
liberators.
On the deck of HMS
war was not
Agamemnon,
over.
anchored off the
British
Greek
controlled
island of
Baghdad
Lemnos,
and Basra,
Ottoman
but they still
representatives
did not
signed the
control
armistice
Mosul.
of Mudros.
The oil fields of the north,
The Great
real
War in the
prize,
Middle
were
East
still
was
in
officially
Ottoman
over.
hands.
The guns
And
were
as the war
supposed
in
to fall
Europe
silent
dragged
across
toward
the
its end in
entire front.
1918,
The
race
lines
for
on the
Mosul
map were
became the
supposed
most
to be
important
frozen in
objective
place.
of the entire
At that
Middle
exact
Eastern
moment,
campaign.
the British army
It
in
was a
Iraq
race
was
against
positioned
time.
just south of
The
Mosul.
British knew the war
They
was
had not
ending.
captured the city.
They knew a peace treaty
According
would
to
be
the laws
signed
of
soon.
war and the
And
explicit
they knew
terms
that
of the
under
armistice,
international law,
Mosul was still
they could only
sovereign
claim
Ottoman
territory they
territory.
physically occupied.
The Turkish
when the final
flag was
whistle
still
blew.
flying over the
The
citadel.
date was October 30th,
The Ottoman garrison was
1918.
still in control. On the deck of HMS Agamemnon, anchored off the Greek island of Lemnos, Ottoman representatives signed the armistice of Mudros. The Great War in the Middle East was officially over. The guns were supposed to fall silent across the entire front. The lines on the map were supposed to be frozen in place. At that exact moment, the British army in Iraq was positioned just south of Mosul. They had not captured the city. According to the laws of war and the explicit terms of the armistice, Mosul was still sovereign Ottoman territory. The Turkish flag was still flying over the citadel. The Ottoman garrison was still in control.